Hey guys, Mahal everyone, 40 the Broadway Saiyan here. Welcome to my YouTube channel, and this time I'm bringing you guys a video on Langrisser Mobile, a recent mobile game that I've started playing since launch. Upon the making of this video, this game recently went global about 4 days ago, January 22nd. And if you guys are a big fan of Fire Emblem or Advance Wars, Final Fantasy Tactics, Disgaea, this game is definitely worth checking out. There's so much to this game, so much depth, and the units and even the story itself is really cool, so definitely check it out. But for this video, I'm going to be talking about an intro to factions and units to pull for. Now, I do want to give a special shout out to a very close friend of mine who goes by the name of Swifty Rick. He actually helped me condense the information in regards to faction as far as the global launch for Langrisser Mobile. So thank you, Swifty Rick, for helping me with this video. But without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about factions. And also, this is going to be an informational video, so just keep that in mind. So, factions are essentially various groups within Langrisser that characters are a part of. So, when you're playing Langrisser and you click on a unit and you click on info, there's two symbols that are right above the statistics of every single unit. And if you're a new player, even for myself, this is something that you might actually miss because the game itself, when it comes to the tutorial, doesn't really point it out. But this is something that's very important for later on in the game, especially as you continue to progress within Langrisser Mobile. R and SR units are generally a part of two factions, while SSR-based units, which is the highest rarity, can be anywhere from 2 to 3 factions. And then each faction will contain specific heroes that provide anywhere from 1 or more buffs to all party members of the same faction. And then understanding how these factions work can actually help determine which units to invest in, as choosing units based on that faction is going to help really make your team more optimal, especially with the later content in the game. And now, a few things I want you guys to know about factions is that they really start to matter when you reach player level 34, where your units can actually be level 35, because that's when your units can actually upgrade their intermediate classes to advanced classes where they unlock these faction buffs for certain characters. But the reason why I'm telling you this is because for those of you that are new, this will give you time to actually strategize and plan out, oh, I want to save up for these units because I want to invest in this faction or that faction. Now, if you guys watch my Dissidia Opera Omnia videos, I'm also going to say that if a unit is your favorite, or if you happen to like a certain unit that comes out, regardless of what faction they are in, then by all means go ahead and pull, because the most important thing is that you're having fun with these games, regardless of what mobile game or console game that you're playing. But if you want to be optimal when it comes to playing Langrisser Mobile, you want to understand how these factions work. Alright, so the first faction we're going to talk about is the Legion of Glory faction. This faction has Almeida, Scott, Jessica, Matthew, Grenier, and then in the second column we have Sherry and Narm, and then afterwards we have Elwin and Ledin, and then afterwards we have Keith, Chris, Aaron, Hein, Liana, and Lester. I almost forgot his name, but Lester. Okay, so something to note about this faction. This is probably the most free-to-play and new player-friendly faction. And the reason why I say this is if you take a look at the first 5 units that's listed, all of those units are obtainable for free when you play through the story campaign. And even though the SSRs obviously are the most ideal for this faction, early on, the Rs or even the SRs that you pull with your tickets or gems can actually replace those SSR units as you're going through the early stages of the game. And not only that, but this faction offers a variety of classes. So you have your cavalry, you have your flyer with Sherry, who's probably going to be your main DPS, and you have a tank with Grenier, and he's a free unit because he's part of the story. Now, obviously, as you build your account and you decide to stick with this faction, some of the units that you want to start really building up and hopefully starting to aim for would be like Elwin, Ledin, who are both SSR. You want to aim for Liana, who is an SSR. And then the reason why we have an asterisk marked for Sherry is because upon the making of this video, there's about maybe a little over 10 days left for you to earn her as a free SSR if you complete 60 achievements. So just keep that in mind. So the reason why we have her marked is because currently right now, Sherry is a free-to-play friendly SSR as long as you complete those achievements. And then Narm, she costs $2, and she's a really good SR. So free-to-play players, I mean, if you have $2 to spare, she's actually a really good ranged unit. But this faction is very friendly towards free-to-play or new players because a lot of flexibility with it, even if you decide to just stick with the free heroes that you get. Now, the available faction buffs with Legion of Glory is going to come from Grenier with his Grand Marshal class. This grants attack and defense up for all Legion of Glory units within range for 4 turns. Keep in mind that any faction buff cannot be stacked with other faction buffs, and faction buffs are castable buffs, so they actually have to cast this buff. And then Ledin is going to be your other Legion of Glory unit. His faction buff comes from the King class. It's also going to be giving an attack and defense up for all Legion of Glory units within range for 4 turns, and it has an additional effect where units also deal 20% extra damage when they're counterattacking. So whenever your Legion of Glory unit gets attacked, as long as you have this faction buff active, they're going to deal an extra 20% damage when counterattacking. And then the last unit that gives a faction buff for this is Elwyn with his hero class. He gets that attack and defense up for all Legion of Glory units, which is pretty standard. And I'm going to say that this is going to be standard for all factions currently within the global version of Langrisser across the board. And his additional effect is that units also deal 15% extra damage when HP is 80% or greater. And this is taking into account your hero and troop HP combined. Alright, the next faction we're going to talk about is the Protagonist faction. So, for those of you familiar with the Langrisser history, if you guys played it with the Sega Genesis, these are going to be your heroes that you're going to be focusing on because they were the protagonists. I'm going to say that this faction is actually not free-to-play friendly. The only units that you could really aim to get if you're trying to be free-to-play friendly is Almeida and Matthew, because they're part of the story. Diehard, and the reason why we have him there is because if you had pre-registered, up until the 26th of January, he was actually a free SSR given out in your mailbox if you pre-registered. But beyond that, unfortunately, he's not free. But hopefully, if those of you that pre-registered for this game, you did get him for free. And then we have Chris, who's an SR at the end. SRs are a little bit easier to obtain than SSRs, and Chris is actually a pretty good unit, and she's actually quite tanky for being a support type of a healer type of a unit. But other than that, it's not a very free-to-play friendly faction. But if you like this faction, go ahead and build it as you continue to play through Langrisser. It is heavily reliant on SSR to be strong, and Matthew is the only unit that has a faction buff for this faction currently. So the faction buff that he provides with his hero class is like any other faction buff, attack and defense up for all protagonist units within range for 4 turns, and the additional effect is if an ally of the protagonist faction is within 2 blocks of Matthew, their attack and intelligence is increased by 15%. So your physical damage dealers are going to be dealing more damage, and then your magical damage dealers will be dealing more damage. And remember, cannot be stacked with other faction buffs, and this is the case for every single faction buff. Next faction we're going to look at is Origin of Light. So for this one, we have Jessica, Diehard, and then we have Freya, Kirikaze, Silverwolf, Sophia, Dios. Shoot, I forgot his name. But those next 2 units against Dios, I forget their name. I think it's Pierre, and then I forget the other guy's name. And then afterwards, we have Tiaris, and we have Luna. So this could potentially be free to play for those of you that pre-registered during before this game came out and you guys got Die Hard in your mail. The reason why I say this is because you have access to 3 R units at the bottom, and then you have a chance of pulling some of the SR units, and then if you get lucky, you would have pulled Tiaris and Luna. Now Freya is going to be an underrated tank for this, because some people tend to forget that she deals damage before combat initiates and right after it happens, as long as she's still alive after combat. So Freya is going to be your tank for this, and I'm going to say that for this faction, the SRs are actually fairly strong, especially Silverwolf, because he is part of the assassin tree, and assassins later on are, if you are familiar with Fire Emblem, for example, these are the type of classes that are they're like your one-hit kill, because they deal so much damage as long as you play them correctly. So the faction buffs available for Origin of Light is Freya with the Royal Vanguard class. So Freya grants attack and defense up for all of the Origin of Light units within range for 4 turns. And then you have Diehard with his High Master class. Same thing, attack and defense up for 4 turns for all the faction units of this faction. And then the additional effect is if a unit within this faction has 5 or more buffs, all their stats are increased by 15%. The next faction we're going to talk about is the Princess Alliance, and this is a very popular faction only because, I mean, look at it. It's full of waifus, and in any gacha game, we all know that most of us love our waifus. So this has potentially to be the highest damaging faction. They're known to be nukers, not only magical based, but physical based too. I mean, you look at that. You got Sherry in there. Sherry has that ability, Wild Princess, which, if you guys aren't familiar with that, is very similar to Fire Emblem's Gale Force, where they can act again after taking an action, where Sherry takes an action again after she KOs a unit, but it does have a cooldown. However, I'm going to say that this is not a free-to-play friendly faction, because to really perform at its best, you want your team to be close to be a full SSR team. So this is the reason why I'm going to say that, unfortunately, this faction is not very free-to-play friendly. And not only that, but if you take a look at it, the only real good tank you have is Freya. You could argue that Chris could be a tank, but other than that, it's kind of lacking as far as tank-wise. And the faction buff for this, currently in the global version of Langrisser, only comes from Luna, and Luna is an SSR, so it's going to be a little bit hard to get that faction buff if you decide to go with this faction. And Luna's faction buff comes from her Pegasus Master class, so standard, it has that attack and defense up for all of the Princess Alliance units for 4 turns, and then the additional effect is every time a Princess Alliance faction deals damage, there is a probability of dealing a fixed damage after combat equal to 15% of the enemy's target's HP. So essentially they get half of what Freya does from Luna's faction buff. That's the additional effect of this. And then the next one we're going to talk about is Honor of the Empire, for those of you Empire fans. So those are the units listed there. We got Lance, we got Anne, Laird, Letitia, who's an incredible R unit. Who else is there? We got Leon, for those of you that pulled for Leon. He's currently, upon the making of this video, a featured unit alongside Bernhardt and Elwyn. So this faction is high mobility. If you take a look at it, there's some pretty high mobility units. Laird, Letitia, Leon. You have, who else? You have Lance, who is the flyer for this. You have Sonia, who is high mobility. And you also have a very powerful tank in Vargas, and Vargas is only an SR. And he's honestly a must-have for this faction. He's one of the most powerful tanks in the game, probably second only to Ledin. And he has that ability where if he's KO'd, he comes back with a certain percentage of HP left for himself and his troops. Now, the cool thing about this faction is that it also shares many core units amongst 2 other factions, which is Strategic Masters and Dark Cycle, which we're going to be talking about later on. And I will say, though, that this faction is probably also not free-to-play friendly, as for this faction to really shine, you really want Bernhardt or Altemuller, as it's really needed to make this faction succeed at its best. And this is also taking into account Strategic Masters and Dark Cycle or Dark Reincarnation. So the available faction buffs for Honor of the Empire comes from Leon with his Royal Knight class. So standard, attack and defense up, and then afterwards the additional effect is whenever units of this faction will deal an additional 5% damage per square they travel, up to 15% prior to initiating combat. So it's very similar to what Leon does with his natural passive. And then the other one is coming from Bernhardt with his Emperor class. Standard, attack and defense up, and then all units from the faction have a 20% damage increase when they are attacking a target they are strong to. So the thing about this is that both of these units, while being SSR, while their faction buffs are okay, they are, especially for Leon, they're very strong standalone units. So you want to kind of consider that when you're building, if you decide to build with this faction or pull for units of this faction. All right, the next faction we're going to talk about is Strategic Masters. It has similarities to Honor of the Empire, like we talked about. High mobility and physical damage, reliant on strong SRs and SSRs, but it has Letitia as a very powerful R unit. So that blonde R unit Letitia is really good because she has that ability where when she ends her turn next to a unit, that unit essentially gains additional mobility for 1 turn. So imagine you attack with her, right? And then let's say she KOs her target, or she doesn't. She also has a chance to move again, and if you move her next to, let's say, a mage, and magical damage units such as mages deal a lot of damage, that unit gains an additional movement, and as you star rank her up, that passive actually grows stronger and stronger, up to 4 units within adjacent space of her to move an additional 1 space. So this is the reason why she's a very powerful unit. Unfortunately, Strategic Masters does lack a strong healer, although Imelda, when you get her to her Queen class, can actually have a mass AoE heal. But other than that, I mean, if you are unlucky and you don't get Imelda, who is an SR, then healing options for this faction are a little limited. And again, just like Honor of the Empire, I feel like this faction really needs Altamuller to shine with his faction buff, because he provides a faction buff for Strategic Masters, which is coming from his Grand Marshal class. Standard, attack and defense up for 4 turns, and then all units of this faction ignore restrictions on all types of terrain, and this is why Altamuller is so needed for this. So if you're standing on top of plains, that's like the standard, right? Easy to move through, but then you have mountains, you have woods, you have, you know, the ocean or the sea. So he removes all kinds of restrictions from that for all units, and units that are on those terrain that increase defense will deal a 15% additional damage when they're standing on that. So that's pretty cool. This is the reason why I say Altamuller is going to be a very necessary unit if you decide to build from this faction. And then the last faction that we're going to talk about that's currently available within the global version of the game is going to be Dark Reincarnation. I'm not sure why the SRs are not appearing on this slide, but essentially it's Egbert, who is an SR mage, and then we also have Vargas, who's an SR tank, so I do apologize for that. But those are the units. We have Egbert and Vargas being SRs, and then those are our SSRs with Bernhardt, Altamuller, Liana, and we also have Bozel. So this faction, Dark Reincarnation, is going to be highly effective in PvP because this faction specializes in debuffs. So they debuff as much as they can, making your opponents essentially they can't really do much to you because their stats are so decreased. However, early on in the game, this faction struggles in PvE. So this is essentially like a late game faction when it comes to PvE. But if you love PvP, this is going to be the faction to go for, and they do lack a good healer. And then Bozel, currently right now with the global version of Langrisser, is the only unit who provides a faction buff. So sadly, unfortunately, Dark Reincarnation is not going to be free to play friendly. But if you like this faction and you want to try to build this up, then by all means go for it. So we're as far as this faction goes, the available faction buffs coming from Bozel from his Dark Prince class is going to be standard, attack and defense up for 4 turns, and then the additional effect is all units of this faction have their stats increased by 15% when battling an enemy with 3 or more debuffs. And then later on, guys, we will be getting more units. So as we get more units, as Langrisser Mobile progresses with the global version of the game, we're going to see more units providing faction buffs for some of the units that don't have multiple units for that. And also, we're going to be seeing some other factions later on. Like, for example, there's a faction called Meteor, which is all about the Assassin class. So if you guys like the Assassin class, then that's going to be the faction for you. So just be ready for that. But essentially, this is going to be an intro for factions because I want you guys to understand that our new players or free-to-play players, which units you want to go for, because as cool as it is to pull multiple SSRs, later on when you get to level 35 and beyond, and you start noticing that, like, wow, I really need to focus on factions because my party is kind of lacking because they're all over the place, this hopefully will help you guys out. Again, special thanks to my friend Swifty Rick for helping me put together these slides, and thank you to you guys for taking the time to watch this. Hopefully this helps you guys out in your journey with Langrisser Mobile. Alright guys, this is 40 the Broadway saying stay tuned for the next video, and mahal everyone.